Hey, welcome back to the Speak Life podcast. This week, it's a little bit different kind of an episode. Normally, it's an interview where we're talking through main challenges pastors face. A few weeks ago, I had Dr. Randy Stone on from down at New Orleans Seminary, and he mentioned after we finished recording that he did a study on as pastors leave, what happens to secondary staff and how should secondary staff be considered in an interim process? And I think it's some really valuable information in there. So we're going to talk that through today. Welcome back to the Speak Life podcast. Hey, welcome back for another episode of the Speak Life podcast. This week, I've got Dr. Randy Stone back. And Randy, I think I'm going to get your title right here. I did not ask you this ahead of time. Director of the Doctor of Educational Ministries and Doctor of Education programs at New Orleans Baptist Theological Seminary. Is that right?
That's correct.
All right. And this is thank you for being here. I know this is your second time on the podcast, and so I really appreciate you being back. The last time we talked through some challenges that pastors face. And you mentioned after we got off the air that you had done a sabbatical study that maybe ties into some things that will be of interest to people watching the podcast. And so I want to give you a chance to talk about that sabbatical study a little bit, and then we'll just kind of jump into it from there.
Okay. Yeah, appreciate the opportunity to be with you today. It was a joy last time, and I actually had to kind of go back and refresh this has been a little bit of time ago since I did it, and a lot of things have happened since then, but the information I think is still pretty relevant. In fact, it may be more exaggerated now than it was even then, some of the issues that surfaced. So delighted to talk about it. And basically, I took during my sabbatical, I decided to research. I was concerned about, from anecdotal information, from friends, from personal experience, what happens when there's a pastoral change to the rest of the staff. Because I just began to see, a lot of them do not survive a pastoral transition for different reasons. And so I kind of had some things in that I thought were reasons for that, but then I wanted to test the waters on that. So I got some names of people in my circles and started building a database, a pool of population, and I sent out surveys to several, like 700, maybe 800 secondary staff people, and asked them some questions about pastoral change. Had they been through one, and what were their experiences? So.
All right. And I'll tell you this, so this hits close to home for me. So I go to a larger church here in Bolivar, and we are senior pastor, stepped down from the senior pastor position. And in the fallout from that, before the new pastor was on site, and we did a pretty intentional interim at our church. It was the previous pastor had been there for 22 years on staff. The first few of those were as associate pastor, and so it was 17 or 18 as the lead pastor. And we did about a year-long, 18-month interim, and so it was pretty intentional about how they conducted things. But we lost 3 of the secondary staff members, and so there was some turnover that was experienced, which, some of that I'm thankful for. My wife is the person who's now the children's ministry director at my church, so that led to something new for her, which I'm very grateful for. But it speaks into what you're talking about, the idea that when the senior pastor leaves, he's usually not the only one. And so talk a little bit about,
in fact, I found that it's like 65% of the staff will leave either during or immediately or within a short period after the arrival of the new pastor. So that's pretty high turnover. And so a lot of times I'll get, for example, just on a story, I'll get calls about a reference for somebody to be a pastor of church, and they, and I answer their questions and try to be honest and everything. And then I'll ask them, well, what are you going to do about replacing the other staff people? And they're like, what do you mean? I'm like, well, you got a 2 out of 3 chance that the rest of the staff will not be with you.
Yeah.
And my speculations, I'm not sure totally were validated, but I think certain types of people are more likely to stay, certain personality types, more phlegmatic personalities, that sort of thing.
I gotcha.
More likely to stick around because they can work with everybody, but more high D's or, very certain personalities seem to be more able to adapt to the change of a new pastor than other
All right.
circumstances.
Fair
so,
enough.
So I try to help prepare when I get those opportunities, speak into it, say, hey, if you get a new pastor, you need to think about your whole staff turnover because it's probably going to happen. So eventually.
Okay. All right. So talk a little bit about what exactly the study entailed. What maybe what got you into studying this, and I think you've talked about that a little bit already. But just what you found.
Yeah, so I started so I asked some questions because I think there's like 4 stages to this process. There's the pastor leaving. So I asked questions about why did the former pastor leave? Was it, because I thought maybe the circumstances of the pastor's departure might be somewhat influential about that decision. Then there's the church. Then what does the church do? How does the staff respond? What are their responsibilities in that? Then what does the church do to manage the interim? There are different models, like you're talking about an intentional interim. And so I asked what were their roles during that interim period, as a secondary staff person. And then a new pastor comes in. What's the reaction or response when the new pastor comes in? How did you manage that? So I asked a series of questions to try to think through those stages of the process. So I mean, I'll give you some numbers. Like, interestingly, the pastoral departures, 31% left to go to a ministry, 25.5% went because of church. They left because of church conflict. Another 25% left because of retirement. So some interesting dynamics of why the pastors leave in the first place. So, and so then I asked questions like, how was the interim filled? And for the most part, close to 50% of the churches said staff basically has the responsibility of running the church, and we get pulpit ministry on weekends of some kind.
All right. So why did the pastor leave is the first question. You kind of broke it down to the top 4 categories. Then you asked questions about the interim. How was the interim handled?
Yeah.
Because it's not something that I think we've talked about a whole lot on the podcast, but there is a reality. If a pastor leaves, it's really important to have an interim that's planned. Because if it's an unplanned, then what you're going to have is an unexpected interim is what's going to happen. You're going to have somebody come in and they're not going to be lasting. They're not going to last for a terribly long time. They're going to end up moving on somewhere else because the interim time wasn't handled well.
Well, in the interim time, and then again, this is a little bit because just to be honest with you, I'm not sure how much honesty comes from some of these conversations because people want to be not perceived as conflict managers or whatever. But the reality is, many of these interims, when the pastor is gone, it opens a power vacuum in the church. Who's going to make decisions for the church? Yep. And if it's a healthy and the staff's respected, I think it works pretty well because there's usually, if there is a staff, somebody can step in, provide some direction to the rest of the staff and that kind of thing. But if it's an unhealthy environment, and so you're leaving out a moral conflict or fights anyway, then there's a power vacuum from key lay leaders or even within the staff sometime for who's going to be the shot caller. And that just exacerbates, that just makes the conflict management more challenging.
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. And I've seen some of that.
Yeah. So I tried to see how that might go. And here's I know personally, when I went through my interim, I just got on the phone and called people who've been through it and say, tell me what you suggest. And here's a couple takeaways that I've got and advice, and I think it was pretty good is, hey, don't start a lot of new stuff. I mean, there's no champion in the pulpit. You're not going to do it. It's a good time to pare back down to the basics, manage the things that you have to manage. If you try to start new stuff, it's just going to create division within the staff or the church, whatever. So take care of the pastoral care needs. When there's no shepherd, the sheep feel restless. So making sure that those things happen in the congregation are important. Make sure, we're making hospital
Yeah.
visits and that sick people know that they're uh, being prayed for and cared about and those kind of things. You elevate that pastoral care component. And then this person told me, he said, and then get your resume ready because, the idea that you won't survive all of this is likely for many of the staff people. So even the people who help manage the interims well, and it seems like there's always at least one staff member that feels responsible to make sure that it comes to a timely conclusion. They may be the last one out the door, but sometime then there's a big departure that
Yeah.
happens around that time. So
Yeah.
those unfortunately are the realities.
So to recap, yeah, and I agree, those are the realities. But I want to recap because I think there's some really important stuff in there. So during a time of interim, if you are secondary staff at a church, uh, be thinking about, I don't want to say maintaining the status quo, but a return to fundamentals. Make sure that the most basic things are happening. Elevate pastoral care to make sure that people know that, yes, we don't have somebody who is the lead person in the pulpit right now, but you are still loved and cared for, and we're still here for you. It provides a level of stability, and at the same time recognizing, and some other people still might leave, and so get the resume ready.
Yeah, and that speaks in some regards to the importance of good systems before we get there. It's like if there's clear decision making processes before you get to an interim, that simplifies. Then you got policies, procedures, or constitution you can rely on. If it's become personality driven decision making and the personalities are gone, then it opens the door for more conflict. So as a staff person and as a pastor, it would be helpful to make sure those things are in place to say who's actually the decision makers about certain things in the church before there's a need to make that decision.
Yeah. Well, and I'm going to say conversely too. There's value in. I mean, if you are the pastor and you're interviewing in a church, so these are some good things to find out. Why did the last pastor leave? Mm-hmm. Tell me about what the interim period is like. And if you find out that they're interviewing you and the interim period's been about 2 weeks and the last pastor was there for about 8 years, or the last pastor was only there for 2 months and the pastor before that was there for 2 months. And
That's right.
Those are things you want to know. And so they're good questions to ask.
When we get to those conversations in a minute about that. So,
okay, go ahead and keep on going.
All right. So here's another takeaway that's pretty important for staff people, and I think churches to know is I asked, were staff people involved in the pastor search process? And 3/4 of the people were not involved in the pastor search process either in no way or any formal way. Only 25% had any kind of intentional involvement with the pastoral search process.
Okay.
So staff people are left out of the process almost completely in most situations, which is a peculiar thing because they're running the church, but you don't want them to be a part of adding a new person to their team. So it does kind of marginalize them in many ways from the beginning. So
yeah, okay. So in your experience with what you've researched, what is your take on when and how secondary staff should be involved?
Well, some of the people reported that the committees got their input on what kind of pastor do we need. They were involved in church assessments and those kind of things. So those were valuable parts of the process at the very least. But I'll jump away to a takeaway. This shocked me a little bit when I asked them, when I asked the people about did the incoming pastor expect time with the staff to discuss culture, philosophy, strategy, or future of the church? 57% said no.
Ooh. Okay,
and then here's a follow-up question related. The new pastor sought to determine strengths and weaknesses of the staff and how he might integrate into the existing staff. 66% no. So 2/3, the pastors aren't even talking to the staff that they're going to go join. They're not meeting with them to say, tell me about the church, tell me about the staff, tell me about the culture of the congregation. They're getting no information apart from what the search committee is giving them about the congregation. They're not
Yeah.
getting anybody that's been doing the work, which is an interesting thing to me.
Yeah. Interesting is one word.
And I mentioned this,
insane is another one.
yeah, and I mentioned this to a pastor one time, that guy that I'd worked with, and he had moved a couple churches, and he would call me when he was moving, and I'd just done this study, and I said, well, tell me about what you're doing to go meet the new staff and working on that. He goes, I said, when you went to meet with them, whatever. He said, oh, I didn't do that. I'm like, well, why not? He goes, well, I didn't even think about it. That concerns me, that pastors
Yeah.
are, and he's a good guy. I mean, I like him, but he's oblivious that this would be helpful information to have going into a new church situation. They're either so desperate. My take is either desperate to get out of where they were, and if they're leaving conflict or scrutiny or whatever, they're just going to a new place. They don't care what it looks like.
Yeah.
Or the grass seems to be so much greener that they're pursuing it without really understanding that green grass requires a lot of fertilizer and water.
Yeah. 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 No due diligence on that. Okay. So, okay. So backtracking a little bit and thinking through what
I think some of those things are all connected to each other.
Oh yeah. No, I totally agree. So in thinking through what is the pathway here in terms of secondary staff, other ministerial staff being connected to the search for the new staff, for the new pastor, at the very least, being a part of the process, being asked, "Hey, what's your view? What do you see as far as our, our church makeup? What are the things that you see that we need in a pastor?" It doesn't sound like
I think that's a philosophy question, a philosophical question, in a way, or strategy. Do we have a good direction our church is going, and do we need to invite can we invite a new person in to keep the direction that's going, or we're dissatisfied with the direction and we need and it's kind of like NFL head coaches or college football head coaches. You get a new one, suddenly he's got all new staffing. And then what happens? The portal gets really busy with people changing because that's not what they signed up for. I mean, we got the same thing in churches now, and so and if churches say we like our church, I'll tell you a story, anecdotal story about a church I know, and man, they had a history. The staff people had been there for years. Some of them, like one of the newest people had been there like 8 years, and everybody had been there like 8 to 20 years, stable, one of the largest churches in the state, reaching people. Pastor leaves.
Yep.
They don't include the staff into the process. They go get a person to come in who they think is going to be really good. Everybody on that staff left within a year or so after he got there. And then within a year after, they had their size of the church went to 50% because they lost all that momentum, and then they've never rebounded completely from that change.
Yeah.
And I think churches are short-sighted, thinking a pastor is going to fix it if it's a problem. And if they're happy with things are going, why not find somebody who can keep that same direction going, and I think there's a lot of there's a lack of foresight sometime into these decisions.
Well, yeah, and just not thinking about how groups work when it comes to group leadership and things like that.
And I think some of this goes back to the multi-staff church. That was another thing. I'll just tell you, when I was calling the state conventions, asking them, only 20% of the churches are multi-staff.
Right.
So most churches are BIVO or single staff churches. And so this process works if you're a single staff church. It requires different ways of functioning if you're a multi-staff church.
Yeah.
And especially if you're a large multi-staff church, it is entirely different on how you feel that pastoral role.
Yeah. Well, it just speaks to the idea of, if your ministry cup has grown, then you've got to grow your policies and stuff to deal with it. Um, so backtracking a little bit when it comes to
I'm sorry. I'm
no,
sorry.
it's all good. There's a ton of stuff here. I do not hear you advocating for, look, you really should have your secondary staff people on the pastor search committee. That's not what I'm
Um,
hearing you say.
they don't necessarily have to be on there, but there's got to be a cooperation and a
Yeah.
partnership of some way. Now, and some of them, some people reported they actually sat and held one of the positions on that committee. But at the very least, there needs to be a staff liaison or some regular communication between that group and the staff to keep them informed. Again, I'll tell you another personal story.
Yeah.
I was at a church. We brought we brought a potential pastor in, had never met him. On the weekend, he's being presented to the church. So he did not meet with any of the staff before, didn't know, nobody knew who he was, kind of secret thing. And then, he's meeting everybody, and I could tell more I won't. Anyway, so it's first time we meeting the person on the weekend,
Yeah.
and they're presenting him to the church on Sunday. And then I got called in. It's like, why aren't you supporting the new pastor? And I'm like, I don't know him. I met him 2 days ago.
Yeah.
It's hard for me to get excited about somebody I met 2 days ago.
Yeah.
And I don't know what his heartbeat is really. And I don't know how he's going to fit with the staff here and all that. So, so there's expectations, I think, from the committee about staff support and all that. But if they're not been part of the process, it's really challenging to do that.
Yeah. Well, and to an extent, it doesn't take into consideration. This is the person who, is going to be my boss, and I didn't have any say in any of this process. My opinion was not deemed necessary. If I word it pretty jaded in the way I'm wording it there, but my opinion was not deemed necessary until the last second, when really my opinion's still not deemed necessary. I'm just getting to meet the guy and getting to know his name and a few maybe details during a very high stress weekend for him anyway, right before the church votes.
Yeah.
And
so I'm afraid that's the way a lot of churches operate. And so part of its committees are not trained to be part to do that, and the search committees. The other side is the pastors aren't I don't know if anybody models that. Hey, before you go to church, maybe you ought to do your homework. Go sit down with the staff that's there.
Yeah.
And talk to them about the nature of the church, the culture, the demands, expectations, or whatever. And that would seem like it would be mutually beneficial. I'm a little concerned in our whole denomination that we have this whole secret process about hiring pastors. I can't tell anybody I'm going to man, if I can't be open and say I'm exploring something that God may be leading me to, pray with me about that. We got deeper issues about secrecy and all of that. In my humble opinion, that's a pretty tough spiritual situation.
It is. So we've got
I'm being pretty honest on this podcast.
Well, no, but that's a worthwhile thing to mention. The idea that in the way we conduct things, when we're talking about, ideally, somebody's maybe looking for a different ministry position because they're feeling led in that direction. Never mind that part of what we talked about is, a quarter of them are leaving because they don't like the way the church conflict goes. As if in the new place there won't be church conflict. It's still made up of humans, so there's going to be some conflict. And so the idea of how things tend to work, why did the pastor leave, how was the interim handled? We've got some other things. There were some other components. You said there were 4 total. And you started getting into one in terms of the actual hiring process, I think.
Here's one of the things I did find. I surveyed handbooks on pastor search committee handbooks. Mm-hmm. I got samples from state conventions and different places. I've got a dozen of them in my resources now. How many of them have a chapter on how to communicate with the staff during the process? Absolutely none.
Yeah.
So so anybody's coming training a pastor search is not even saying, hey, you need to talk to the staff through this process, and then the pastors then aren't clued into, hey, part of our process is We're going to make you sit down and talk to the staff that's here. We're going to have you, work with them. Here's profiles of all the people that are in our staff, or here's, whatever. And and staff people know he's going to be the boss. He's going to be there's no uncertainty about that. But then I should have the option as a adult called minister, whether or not I want to work in that environment that he's going to create or not.
Yeah.
Right? That ought to be a choice I have, and seldom do the staff people get those same choices.
Yeah. And from your perspective and your research, why do you think that is? Why isn't it included in any of these books? Why isn't it thought about? I mean, I can think of some ideas, but you've looked at it a lot more than I have.
Yeah, I think most of our models are built off of single staff church models, since that's 80% of our churches.
Yeah,
they don't have to worry about a staff person.
Yeah, that makes sense.
80% of the stuff's probably written for that group, and it may work for that group. But the other 20% are a lot of people, and they're in large churches, and they're disruptive. And if you're at a large church and the youth pastor kind of gets forced out because of a new pastor, guess what? You make a lot of youth parents angry because they fell in love with that youth pastor or that children's minister or that worship pastor. So anyway, I just think there's not an orientation because of history and the size of churches and that sort of thing. I don't know. I hate to say it, there may be a little bit of pastorism that, that position is held in such regard, and the other staff people are often perceived as hirelings more than leaders or pastors. In a lot of churches, I know that's true, so. I think if churches if those other things can value, and I'll share some more things if you want, but if they're valued in other ways, because when I survey, these are people that are still in ministry. You know which group I was concerned about? The number of people who dropped out of ministry after this happened, that I don't know who they are. And I think that's a significant number of people. And that's what a lot of these people reported, being hurt. They felt like their families weren't taken care of.
Yeah.
They were disposable when the new pastor came in. That's some human tragedy that nobody talks about.
So there's definitely a need, a significant need. And I think this is what you're recognizing and why you did your sabbatical study in the first place. There's a need to deal with this differently, to deal with this well on behalf of staff. So with that being said, and given, kind of how much time we've already talked, what are the things what are the top 2 or 3 pieces of really practical advice you'd give to staff members at a church? Hey, here are the things that you should do. Or for pastors who are listening to this that know, hey, I am in the process of looking. These are some things I can tell my congregation so that they can prepare well for an interim. What are the things you would say?
Well, pastors that are leaving, they ought to be honest with their congregations about why they're leaving, and not sneak out the back door over something. I mean, say, hey, I've exhausted all of that I think I can do here, or I'm feeling, we all feel called to new places sometime. God has us shift in our callings and that sort of thing. And if we can't be honest about that, then the kingdom is too small for us. Jesus moved ministries. Paul changed. Sometimes he was in places 3 weeks, sometimes 3 years. This idea that, so I think we've got to create an openness about that. I may not be here for the rest of my life. Pastors want churches want somebody there the rest of their life, but until they don't, until he's been there 10 years and they're ready for him to leave, then they change their mind about it. So, some I think churches go through seasons and lifestyle where you say, hey, this type of person is what this church needs for these 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, whatever. So I think if we can be honest that changes are going to happen, and they're happening every day, and let's be honest about that. I think pastors on the pastor side, when they're going to a new place, need to, if the committees don't recommend it, they need to be proactive about entering and onboarding into that new church by having the same type of transparency and openness. And listen, if you can't trust the staff you're going to go to about keeping even if it's early and you want the conversations to be confidential, If you can't trust them, then what makes you think they're just going to get better when you get there?
Yeah.
And if that's what you want to find out, that's a good way to find out, because you can go to neutral sites and be away and have a meeting and talk to people and have there's ways to do that. From the church standpoint, they need to get good training on pastor search processes and in ways to include the staff. From state conventions, they need to include that training, part of that training in their handbooks and in what they're guiding the churches to do. Is if they're in a multi-staff church, there are other parts of the process they need to be trained about.
Yeah.
Not just how do you put a salary package together and select a committee.
Yeah. Yeah.
From a church staff position, one of the things I found, if a pastor loses his position because of whatever reason, the state conventions, many of them have resources for GAP for that pastor. Health insurance, a stipend, a monthly stipend. There's resources in virtually every state available to them. So my question to follow up with the state guys was, what's available to the staff? And they said it was exactly the same. But I said, but if the pastor is the primary conduit from the church to the state convention and he's not there, how do those staff people know those resources are available? And there's no regular communication between those states and associations to the local church to know when those pastoral changes are happening. And can I reach into the staff and say, hey guys, I know your pastor's gone. Here's some resources. If something happens that you get dismissed or lose your position, here's healthcare or here's counsel. All of them have counseling to help. Yeah. I don't know that staff people know how to access them.
Yeah.
So we have this big gap between what's available and what the communication needs to happen.
So finding pathways to close that gap, being intentional about letting people know. Man, it feels like there's
I'm uncovering a lot of stuff here, huh?
No, but it's good stuff. It's important to talk about. It's just a lot to unpack and to think about. So why don't we do this? Because we're out of time for today. Let's go from here and.
Yeah, because you got the functional side. We didn't really get into the human side of this. That's what was so discouraging in my findings. The people that say, man, my family was devastated. I lost my job. The new pastor came in and cleaned house. I didn't have a place to go. It took me a year and a half to find another ministry position.
Yeah.
I mean, I got all those stories and anecdotes that were filled out, and my heart's breaking when I'm reading these things.
We've covered a lot of the kind of more practical side of things. We didn't talk as much about the human relationship side of things and how human relationships are impacted when some of these things happen. That'd probably be worth revisiting some other time to go through and talk about.
That's your wheelhouse right there anyway, isn't it?
Well, yeah, that's where I camp out a lot in terms of thinking through how this affects people. And that's a different way to think about burnout when somebody's gotten burned that hard and how that plays a role. Whether we're talking about secondary staff, there's plenty of primary staff that's how they end up. The lead pastor, that's how they end up leaving, is because they've gotten burned really hard. So the value of the intentional interim and being able to think through these things clearly when we're talking about a multi-staff church, which is not what most of the interim processes are geared toward. So, Randy, thank you for sharing. Thank you for being willing to be on again today and talk some of this through. Thanks for listening, everybody, and we'll have a new episode for you next week. God bless.